Alright, we are recording, and now comes the part that is going to make the code Nazis absolutely flip out. The editor palette. The editor palette extends JPanel. It's got a lot of data objects that make sense. It's got a different array list for each one of the different palettes. There's 6 of them so far. There's a reference to the RoomEditorPanel, the scroll pane, whichever one's selected. There's a couple of these that are unique, such as the goal palette and the start level palette. We have references to those. And it's mostly in the constructor here that you're going to freak out. First of all, I have a lot of different methods that add palette items to the different layers. And where do I begin here? There's a lot of copy-pasted code. Add new to block palette, for instance, here. Static block palette object. That's right, I'm reusing this class. If it's got null for its character, then that's a sign that it's going to be different. And these true and false things, that essentially says whether it's an edit button or a new button. Instead of creating a new palette object icon to say, click this to create a new, click this icon to create a new palette object, I just recycled static block palette object. That kind of thing might have made sense when I was first putting together the editor just to get it to work, but I never refactored that out and created another class for new or edit buttons. Let's see. And I think I'll just dive into this, and I am not proud of this. Alright, what I'm looking for here is what happens when you click on one of these. And I think I can find that out pretty easily. Let's try this, onClick enemy. This is the method that gets called when you click on the editor palette while we are looking at the enemy and NPC layer. If it's the instance of the object select palette object, that's essentially the arrow that lets you click on a palette object and then drag it around. Okay, if P, which is the point at which the mouse click happened, no, not that. If the palette object is an instance of the static block palette object and it's a clone button, then clone current selection. If it's a new button, then we unselect everything and say new custom NPC was clicked. And it gets better. The way I tell whether it's going to be a new custom NPC or a new speaker NPC is if the this is an edit button flag is also on. I just know that the code Nazis are going to barf when they see this. Alright, if it's a static block palette object and it's an edit object, then edit enemy layer was clicked. I think this is enough to give you an idea of how things work in the editor palette, and there is a lot of room for refactoring. This total class size is over 7,000 lines, and it wouldn't surprise me greatly if you could get that to under 3,000 if you just took all of these, add this to the palette, add that to the palette methods, and somehow combined them together into one that performs most of the tasks that each one of these individually performs. Add eraser. And even though we're talking about the widget layer, which is the foreground layer, which contains goals, hurt zones, and I forget what all else, we still have a static block palette object, and it's got a space, which essentially means nothing here. And that also erases things. It also erases things for layers that have nothing to do with static blocks. And static block basically means the tile map. All in all, I have to say I'm not altogether proud of the editor palette class. I mean, it does what it's supposed to do, but the code is ugly and it just screams refactor me, and I have been not doing that despite the fact that I've been on this project for about 5 years now. So yeah, this is probably one of the first things that's going to get refactored. And each one of these add this to the palette methods gets called in the editor palette constructor. Add clone to enemy palette, add eraser to enemy palette, add red enemy, add blue enemy, add orange, green, gray, yellow, violet, rainbow boss. Let's see. I feel like there's another method I should dive into here. Well, you know what? I think we're going to sort of bleed over what this code review is going to be covering by going into the editor canvas a little bit. I believe that when you create an object, well, yeah, when you create a screen object in here, then the screen object can be an instance of any one of different classes, and I think one of the classes that I've got is moving object. So let's see, moving block sprite. If it says sprite in it, then generally that class is part of my game engine. If it says screen object or palette object, then that's part of the editor. Okay, movement, moving block sprite, moving object. Huh. Alright, let's try hurt zone screen object. Hurt zones are one of two things. Okay, that's what I'm calling it, mobile screen object. And maybe this class name ought to be changed, because the way I set up hurt zones is you click on place in the editor, then you set the left and right bounds for the hurt zone if it's horizontal. Otherwise, you set the above and below bounds for it. And the graphics and overall setup that I use for setting up the hurt zones is exactly the same as the setup that I have for moving screen objects, such as the gray enemy, the green enemy, or moving block. So I ended up having hurt zones extend mobile screen object. It's in screen objects that I start to do things along the lines of polymorphism and inheritance. Let me just take a look at this. Okay, this is another chunk of code that probably should have been moved up into mobile screen object. If you look at the draw method here, what I do is I set the color to blue, draw two lines about 5 pixels away from the center in each case. Then I set it to blue with some green in it, 4 pixels, more green, 3 pixels, still more green, 2 pixels, almost entirely green, 1 pixel. Now we're up to cyan, which is 100% green and 100% blue, and then we draw the center bit. And as you can probably guess, I do the same thing down here with drawing down to the maximum. I start with red, slowly add green to it until we get here where we're 100% green and 100% red, and that's yellow, and that's in the center of it. Probably this code that draws the gradient color minimum and maximum whiskers should probably be in mobile screen object, so that's some more refactoring that can happen. Here is where I do the horizontal stuff, and once again, you start with green, add red until you get yellow here. And then I do the same thing, start with blue, keep adding red until you get magenta, and that'll be in the center. You get the idea. It's, yeah. That probably should have been moved up into mobile screen object. Let me just see what mobile screen object has in it. Well, it's an abstract class, so it can have that kind of thing in it. You can move it from place to place. You can get the palette object, and it's a mobile screen palette object. I don't know how that's different from other types. Draw initial direction indicator. That's funny. I have an initial direction indicator for moving objects, but I don't have the minimum and the maximum. Yeesh. How much time have I got here? About 4 more minutes. Might as well jump into mobile screen palette object here. Again, it's an abstract class. Mode. I think that's whether we're, yeah, it's this stuff here. This is what we set to the mode, and if it's default, then we're not setting either the min or the max. Click once, then it goes to setting min, and depending on where you move your cursor, that colored bar will appear. Click, and then it goes to setting max, and then you're doing the other bar. Click again, and then it goes back to default. Okay. So yeah, there's polymorphism and inheritance when it comes to screen objects, and I believe there's also some when it comes to palette objects. On-off flag controlled screen palette object. I don't even know what that is. I've got a little time left, so event flags to controls on-off. Huh. Alright. I'm not exactly sure why I did this, but I did. And I believe there's even more here. Palette object is itself a different... okay. Screen palette object means you can create a screen object by calling create, and there's also a delete method here. Palette object is even higher in the hierarchy. That has a click rectangle. You can tell whether it's selected or not. There's the distance to the border and the border width. There's an image, and there's a reference to the editor panel. This doesn't necessarily generate a screen object. Probably this could have been named better. Anyways, you can tell there's tons of refactoring to do with the editor in general, the editor palette specifically for sure.